please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. David Anderson Hooker to his first cover conference.
Good morning, good afternoon. This is my first cover conference. It's also, so in the introduction, it was curious because she said informed by mimetic theory. And so I would say informed is kind of loosely constructed. I see this as a grand opportunity with you all here. So I think the most challenging piece of the discussion is that this is supposed to be a lecture. I have been a lecturer. I have had academic posts at the University of Notre Dame, at Eastern Mennonite, University of Georgia, and I primarily don't lecture. It's just not the style of engagement that I have. So I'm going to try and talk. I'm going to try and share some ideas about this process of transformative community conferencing. And then I'm going to invite, I hope, you all to ask questions, to critique, to invite your insights into where, if at all, mimetic theory and some of the practices that you're aware of may inform this, because it's an evolving process. This is probably going to be a distraction because it's not in my notes or anything, but I just want to share this with you. Recently, I was working with a group in the sister cities, the sister states in Northeast India, the Shantani people. And they have the most impactful greeting that I've ever heard. And so I thought I would bring it to you. I would share it with you. The greeting that they offer to one another when they see each other is Johar. Johar, Johar. There's no real good English direct translation, but what they say that it means is, I acknowledge your humanity before I know your name. I express your dignity even before I hear your story. So, Johar. Our work, I'm just going to pass through this really quickly. I do want to talk about the process, the TCC process, and get your thoughts and input on that. And I think that the way to do that is to do kind of a discussion of limitations and opportunities, a very brief kind of tour of my journey that got me to TCC, where I think that there might be some convergence, and a few undergirding background concepts, and then talk about the process itself. That's where I want to spend most of the time, is thinking about the process itself. So let's quickly do the other pieces. Let's dispense with these. Limitations. I'm not a scholar of Girard or mimetic theory. Get that out of the way, right? And so all the places where you see, oh, well, if he knew this, so you can identify it and help me to name it without necessarily having that kind of a critique that comes from a place other than goodness, right? I'm not a theologian. I play one on TV from time to time. I show up, trying to do some exegetical work related to the gospel I preach a lot. I'm not an anthropologist. So these are all limitations. When I was developing TCC, although I exposed seminary to Girard really through the portal of Walter Wink, the mimetic theory was not the basis upon which I was developing this. And then I've only had a little bit of time to really work on and massage kind of an alignment. So those are limitations. But that's also an opportunity, because I've only had a little bit of time, and because transformative community conferencing is an all evolving process, we have the opportunity for you all to share insights with me and to begin to incorporate mimetic theory into peace building. There's talked to a couple of folks at the reception last night, and there are a couple of people that I respect in terms of their peace building practice who have been connected to some of these conversations. And so they may show up. But most of the people that I reference in my peace building practice don't reference mimetic theory. I think there may be a shortcoming to that, and you all can help me to think about that, right? So let me just do a very brief overview of my journey to transformative community conferencing. If you are a geography scholar of any sort, you will recognize this as an aerial view of the Meander River in Turkey. You may or may not know that the meandering is a reflection of this river. Slow flowing, seemingly unpurposeful move towards the Aegean Sea, which looks very much like my professional practice. Slow moving, not necessarily seemingly purposeful, but starting out in clinical psych, minority mental health, realizing that most people who get diagnosis aren't getting diagnosis because of something that has to do with their internal flaws. The fatal flaws in their character aren't the basis for their challenges in life. And so I went off to find some other ways to help them. So I started doing mediation, studied public policy, public health policy primarily, went and eventually got around to law. And I was only supposed to do law so that I could get paid more as a mediator. And I got distracted by the theater of the courtroom. I love court. I'm a theater guy. I love the theater of the courtroom. And so I got distracted, and that took me for a while into the practice of law at a fairly extensive level. And at some point, as the scriptures say, he came to himself, realized what I was supposed to be doing, and went back off to do more mediation, public policy, restorative justice work. Along the way, doing mediation, restorative justice, dialogue, we got this expression, this idea that an enemy is a person whose story you haven't heard. And so people focus so much in dialogue, in restorative justice, and mediation on hearing one another's stories, as those stories will change things. And what I discovered, I was working with a group of descendants of former enslaved and descendants of former enslavers from the same plantation systems. So these are the Jeffersons and the Hemmings, the Hairstons, and any number of others. We were working together trying to figure out how, if at all, they could move towards reconciliation. And it was in those engagements that I realized that story is insufficient to create transformation at any level. Stories need to be told inside of a different narrative framework. And so I went off to develop other models of engagement, which took me from the transforming historical harms work into understanding the narrative work, the construction, performativity, performing Greensboro. This is the distinction I want you to make between stories and narratives. A lot of time people use these terms interchangeably, and I would invite you to be more specific when you're using these. A story, everybody knows stories. It's the most enduring form of human technology. Living, local, it's standard form. It has a beginning, a middle, and there's a challenge, there's a choice, there's an outcome of some sort. Stories. We recognize what stories are. But stories generally conform to particular narratives. So narratives give the template. Stories are always told in hindsight. Narratives craft our way going forward. Question, have any of you ever been surprised? Have any of you ever been disappointed? Yeah. Let me try one other one just to make sure that we're getting this. One of my law professors would say, let me change the facts ever so slightly. Have any of you ever been disappointed but not surprised? Yeah, you recognize that? So all of those, the disappointment, the surprise, don't exist in the observations that you're making. It's not in what you're seeing. It's not in what you're hearing. It's not in what you're not seeing or not hearing. The disappointment and the surprise and so many other emotions are reflective of the narrative that's running in your head and the gap between that narrative and the observations you're making. You're only surprised because it's not what you thought it was supposed to be. The narratives are what is giving you the template for how the story is supposed to go going forward. And then when it doesn't happen that way, you get surprised, you get disappointed. But the narratives, because the narratives are shaping the way people live, particularly in communities, their background narratives that shape the way people live and the experiences they have that limit their full flourishing, you can't make changes in people's lives substantially by just allowing them to tell a different story. You have to transform the narratives that are shaping their existence, right? And so that's what we're working with. So one of the ways I like to think about this is you think about stories as cars. But if a story is a car, the narratives are the highways. The car can only go where the narratives allow them to go. And so when you feel constrained, when you feel trapped by a particular set of narratives, that's how people live their lives. This is at the family level, at the community level, at the organizational level, at the national and international level. And so narratives do the work of connecting a variety of stories. I'm blowing through some of this, and I hope if you have questions, we can play with it. I want to save plenty of time for questions for sure. The narratives are our sense makers, and those senses that we have, the way that we make sense of things causes us to create habits. So when I was saying last night that Suzanne was asking, am I white? And I was saying, whiteness is a habit. There are certain habits, there are certain ways of engaging the world based on this narrative of whiteness, and you form habits around that, and then you get surprised when it doesn't happen. And then each of us has a library of narratives. Some of them are wider than others, but the narratives, this is borrowing from Pierre Bourdieu's notion of habitus. The narrative habitus allows us to adjust to what we're seeing based on how wide or how complex the narratives are that we have access to. So these are some of the concepts in transformative community conferencing. The process looks simple, but these are many of the concepts that undergird it that I think are important to bring out. Winslade and Monk's narrative, mediation, and therapy, all the restorative justice practices. This is all stuff that I'm picking up along the way as I meander through my professional life. My notion of valences of identities, social construction, Galtung's violences, his three variations of violence, which I think is one place where there's resonance, and then Butler's performativity. So all of those are important undergirding components. People who participate in a transformative community conferencing need know anything about any of those. When people are trying to transform their lives, when people are looking for greater options for full flourishing, one of the things they often push against is the role of power in their lives. And it's not power over, it's not power with, it's not power that's oppressive or repressive. I'm using the Foucauldian notion of power as a relational commodity, right? And so when we're trying to understand the way that communities are shaped, understanding the relational power that exists, that shapes identities, that shapes what people believe are their possibilities, is the kind of power that that has to be transformed. And the narratives contain and distribute power. This is the notion of a narrative. It distributes power. If that doesn't make sense, let me know. There are three places where I think there's some shared resonance between what mimetic scholars are trying to address and maybe what we're doing in transformative community conferencing. And so levels and measures and types of violence and how those get embedded and how they get perpetuated through myths, metaphors that guide society and undergird our relationships in society. And then kind of a nested theory, how those myths and metaphors and direct and cultural violences exist at every level of society and over multiple time signatures. And so a nested theory. All of that is kind of where I think there's resonance with what you all are up to. And I hope to talk a little bit more about that. I hope you give me some insight on that. So now let's get to the part that actually I was supposed to be talking about, which is what is transformative community conferencing? About 1/3 of one chapter of my dissertation work got reduced to this little book of transformative community conferencing. I commend it to you for your consideration. But what is the purpose of it? What are we doing? Trying to unveil the narrative frames that shape participants' lives. This is the thing. When you're in conflict, most conflicts aren't relational. We think conflicts are about relationships, and most conflicts that you're in are not relational. They are embedded in the power and the expectations that are shaping how you're addressing or understanding or making meaning of the context. The conflicts are when narratives are clashing, not when people are clashing, but when the narratives that the people are using to make meaning, to interpret their context is clashing, right? And so our work, particularly at the community level, in denominational work, in congregational work, is to unveil the narrative frames that are shaping people's lives, to notice the presence of alternative stories that are more aligned with a preferred narrative, and then to identify relationships, resources, structures, and testimonial authority that's needed in order for full flourishing to be more possible. And then to use all of those discoveries to develop a transformational plan. If you've spent any time looking at some of these peacebuilding practices, restorative justice, structural dialogue, structured or sustained dialogue, mediation, family conferencing, any of those things, these are differences between transformative community conferencing and all of those other peacebuilding practices. Focusing on narrative instead of just story, focusing on being transformative and not restorative, focusing on conferencing and not just dialogue. If you ever participated in dialogue with people who are hurting, it is one of the most frustrating things, because dialogue is designed, the invitation is for us to know each other better, but the invitation includes, you don't have to change. We're not here to change your mind. We're not here to change the system. We just want you all to know each other better. When people are suffering, knowing one another better and knowing that you now know why I'm suffering is very frustrating, because we have now accomplished this thing that the dialogue set out to do, to know each other better, not to make a change. We're working on transformation, not just restoration, not just improving people's knowledge of self and other, which makes a difference in my mind. So really quickly, what are the steps in a transformative community conferencing process? Externalizing the conversation, mapping the dialogue, reverse mapping, making a choice, choosing, and then building a plan for action. And I'm only going to focus a little bit on the first 3 of those steps, because that's where I think we have our work. Externalizing the conversation. People aren't the problem is the problem. I always start with this as an assertion. And if I say that to you, many of you will immediately accept it, and some of you will resist the idea that people aren't the problem. It is so much easier if people can be identified as the problem. People aren't the problem is the problem. Part of the reason this is really important to me is because I've worked in Bosnia and Croatia and Serbia, where people were the problem. And the way to solve the problem was to get rid of the people. I've worked in Rwanda. I've worked in Myanmar. And every time you identify the people as the problem, then the notion is to get rid of the people. Anytime you decide that immigrants are the problem and you want to get rid of immigrants, right? There are a variety of ways that you can do that, many of which are relatively violent and dehumanizing. We get a chance to see that up close. The people aren't the problem. The problem is the problem. How do we name it? And then name it in ways that allow for a clear sense of what's actually problematic. Let me make this other distinction between what we talk about as being problematic and being a problem. If it's a problem, that means it has a solution. It at least implies that there is a solution. Problematic suggests that it's much more complex. It's the difference between math and chemistry. Both of them have solutions, but in math, there are particular, very specific solutions. This isn't that. This is chemistry, where you can add a number of different things. You can arrive at the same reaction by multiple different pathways, right? And so we're working on trying to identify what is problematic in a community or in a context. And then having named it, we notice how those problematic narratives are forcing people or disciplining people to act in certain ways. And so people act in ways that actually become complicit with the problem. They become complicit with the violence that they would otherwise critique. And so we say that these communities that we're looking at, these contexts that you're looking at, are primarily sustained by the conversations that the community is holding with itself. And so we want to unveil those. For the last 3.5 years, I've been working with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the U.S. and Canada, going to every region and every major board. And what we do is, in each region, we map what's happening in that region. So what's in the middle, the yellow, is supposed to be, in some level, it is the basis or the core for the problematic. And so in the Kansas, in the Tri-Regional Partnership, they said that tradition gets in the way. The clergy, many of whom are burnt out, they don't even know what change means. There's a narrative that they don't even talk about the story of Jesus. They struggle with the story of Jesus. They had a lack of interrogation of their faith story. And all of that emerges from the basis of racism, the commitment to maintain church power, the commitment or the disconnect between words and actions. There's a lack of biblical literacy. There's a fear of change that's also connected with a misogyny and ageism in multiple directions. And then there's this kind of core, at least in the Tri-Regional Partnership, there's a core narrative of individualism combined with nationalism that results in them not listening to one another, having a myopic view of what's possible, being closed off to new ideas, they have a loss of relationship to spirit, to God, and they have a commitment to taking care of their own. And that brings together all of the actions that support a survival of institution and self as being more important than a survival of the gospel narrative. That's what they said. Right? And we're trying to figure out in this region what is possible, because this is what's shaping, this is the complex, problematic narrative that's shaping their experience in congregations and between congregations and communities. But if you give them enough time, they also can identify things that are happening that are reflect an emerging narrative of a preferred future. So they said in those same congregations that have this other problematic narrative. There are examples of forgiveness and reconciliation. There's a healthy accountability. You're starting to see an increase in LGBTQ women, POC leaders. It seems to them like they were noticing small pockets where God was raising up prophets over prophets. They're engaging community, but from a space where they're not taking it on as with a savior complex or a colonial mentality. And they're gathering with others amidst different beliefs. And all of that is possible because they are rooted in justice and Jesus. There's an increasing relationality that's built in trust and compassion. They have faith in a loving God, which is allowing them to move through grief. And there's an honesty that the vision is bigger than any one of them in the church, and that commitment and persistence and hospitality is allowing them to do amazing things in their congregations. So both of those are true. At the same time, in the same congregations, we spend enough time with them figuring out that both of those are shaping their experience. And then you do, in Transformative Community Conferencing, you do the most important thing, which is to suggest that choice is available. If you had someone who visited your congregation, who visited your region and just passing through, would you want them to have as a primary experience the first narrative or the second narrative? And you've got to make a choice because both of them are there. And so every day in every action you're taking, you're making a choice. And you make a choice between this dominant narrative, which seems to take most of their time, and you put that next to the counter narrative, the preferred narrative, and you give them time to recognize that both are present at the same time. They tell stories. They share stories about how that first narrative is impacting them. Second, third generation. So it's not just impacting them in the congregation, but what is the attitude that they take into the community and into their work that's reflective of that same thing? They have to make a choice. You invite them to make a choice, and then you reinforce for them the power to choose and the necessity to choose. And then they sit with the fact that the choice is always present. It's like the red slippers. You get them a chance to make this choice, and then the choice is always before you. The choice is always before us. Will we believe that this realm of God is in fact at hand? And how do we organize our lives to reflect that? That's a choice. And then based on the choice you make, we do some planning. And this is an insight that we got. Wolfgang, I think I got this from Byron. Yeah. Our work is to build a narrative of a shared future, not necessarily a shared narrative of the future. Do you see the distinction? We're not building a shared narrative of a future, which is one of the fatal flaws in mediation and restorative justice and dialogue, is we try and start with an agreement together about what the future will be. And people are starting from different places, and usually that new future is projected based on the current distribution of power that exists. How do we build a narrative of a shared future, a commitment to everyone's full flourishing? And so when every individual, every group, every being has the capacity, has the related resources, they need to fully flourish, possibilities for emerge, the possibility for justice emerge, possibilities for true reconciliation. Sometimes people talk about it this way in religious and faith settings because this feels too much like just practical community building. And so we have conversations that are more structured around values and those kinds of commitments. And then whatever we develop as a plan, you always have to remember to celebrate. Celebrate small accomplishments, celebrate large accomplishments. If they ask me to design it, I'm going to suggest that we dance. I like to dance. I think that's actually enough about the process. So thank you all for having me. I appreciate it very much.